I'm glad to see you all again this afternoon. My name is Christine Robinson. I am the president of Philanthropy Network, and I'm thrilled to join you this afternoon for our session on violence with a focus on gun violence and community. I'm joined by my colleague, Anne Marie McGrory, who is going to also make a few comments on some of the work that the Stoneleigh Foundation has been engaged in. And I'm going to share a few slides with people. So I'm just going to start with a brief overview on community violence and some of the etiology. In the earlier session with Alandra Washington, we talked a lot about comprehensive focus and looking at how there's some overarching contextual issues around violence in the lives of children. So I wanted to just talk very briefly about that. So I'm going to start from, let's go back one. Can everybody, I'm hoping people can see my screen and the slides. This quote I find to be very prescient and relevant. When a flower doesn't bloom, you fix the environment in which it grows and not the flower. And I think any of us who are gardeners know that we would be on a fool's errand if we went out into our garden every time there was a flower that didn't bloom and we tried to pay particular attention to that particular blossom. We know that it's a question around soil quality, a question around water, sunshine, placement. Is it in the right location? So the same thing is true with us as human beings in looking at the environmental and contextual factors. Many of you are probably familiar with a number of disparities of health frameworks and the social determinants of health. And so if you look at this iceberg model, we know that there may be disparities in health and outcomes that are caused by housing, substance use, racism, school suspension, incarceration, environmental contamination. And I want to talk about that for a bit, because I come from a long background in the whole issue of health disparities and looking at violence as a public health issue. The way that that has been framed, quite frankly, is it is increasingly a cause of morbidity and mortality. And I had the great good fortune of working with Dr. Deborah Prothero-Stith, who was Commissioner of Health for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And we began some of the first federally funded violence prevention programs. I'm dating myself, but it was in the 1980s that we first started looking at violence as a public health issue. There were 3 coalitions that were funded by the federal government then. One was in Boston, Massachusetts, which I staffed, and the other in Lawrence, Massachusetts, which I staffed, and the third one is in Contra Costa County in California. So I've been looking at this issue for some time. I want to move on to, in talking about the contextual factors, the work of Yuri Bronfenbrenner in looking at how we as individuals are affected by a whole host of systems. What happens in our families, what happens in our communities, what happens in the states that we live in, and what happens outside as far as social policy and federal policy. So who tells the story and what the story is has lifelong implications for us. And I'm going to talk about that briefly a little bit further. We heard from Kiva, who talked about going beyond diversity training and getting far beyond DEI is really looking at the whole issue around bias and socialization and how it has shaped our social institutions, our policies, and looking at the fact that policy change across multiple domains, and we talked about this a little bit earlier with Alandra Washington, is necessary if we're really going to get beyond some of these structural components. Many of you are probably familiar with the social determinants of health and well-being. I know that a lot of folks at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation look at this and how our physical environment, if there are employment opportunities, the financial status of people in community, what the social environment is like, all has lifelong implications, and all of this matters. The real reason that we look at this is the history of place. And in the Philadelphia region, looking at the legacy of racism, of people being othered, being excluded, immigrants, people who are not documented, people who are unhoused because they've been in the criminal justice system and haven't found a place to live, people who are struggling with substance use or with behavioral health issues in inadequate systems. And so the forced removal and relocation of people in isolation has had significant problems within our society. I want to briefly look at the psychological work of Bobby Harrow. This particular schema looks at the fact that when we're born into a world as a blank slate, but then we're socialized by the people who love us the most. I talked a little bit about my own socialization process. Our families, our relatives, the schools that we're in, we're taught who matters and who doesn't. And these messages are reinforced within churches, within schools, within our culture. And so if, for example, I am taught, and I was not, but for example, Aunt Becky has Down syndrome, and we're embarrassed by her. And so, yeah, we bring her home at Christmas for dinner, but she doesn't live with us, and we really don't talk about her. I think all of us know that in our society, we don't see people with a variety of disabilities being glorified in fashion magazines, on TV commercials, on billboards. They're primarily hidden away. And that particular a negative stereotype is enforced and sanctioned. The group is stigmatized. So it results within people with a disability, a dissonance, being dehumanized, a sense of self-hatred. And so if the notion is that Black men are violent, that people with darker skin color and hair textures that are different are not valued, these result in a certain sense of their own loss of a sense of self. And this cycle, unfortunately, perpetuates itself. If we do nothing, it perpetuates, and it's born of a core of fear and ignorance and insecurity. Or we can change and raise consciousness, which is at the heart of what our work is all about. The reason that this matters is we look at children growing up in societies, and I think that you all know that there are neighborhoods that are very much like this in the Philadelphia region, as well as neighborhoods that are much like this. And this has to do a lot with our brain development. If you wake up every morning and you look out the window at this, you're seeing something, and there's a message, as I talked earlier about mattering, both adding value and being valued. Children living in this environment have a constant societal message that they are not valued. And this is very, very important for their own sense of self. This is adapted from the Journal of Pediatrics. And exposure to discrimination in children, it actually leads to, if you look at individual exposure, either children being teased or bullied, observing a family member being discriminated against, exposure at the macro level. And how often do we see Black men being stopped by police, children locked at the border, the lack of models among our school personnel, pictures hanging on walls in schools, and this constant barrage of media exposure at the macro level. What it results in is exactly what we don't want to see in children who are of school age: decreased sense of self-efficacy, depression, hopelessness, anger. And so this is where we start looking at this whole issue around violence. I'm angry at me, and I'm angry at the world. And so I'm not giving a pass here, but I think, as we talked about, the childhood roots of some of these messages are really important for us to examine. When we look at the biology, there's actually a change in the allostatic load. Any of those who've looked at the work of Dr. Bruce McEwen, he started looking at stress and allostatic load at cortisol levels, which results in what we're seeing now in our society with COVID: decreased immune function, increase of cortisol level and blood pressure. And so the outcomes are things that are lifelong. We see an increase in low birth weight and premature birth, risk behaviors, aggression, once again, as we talk about violence, and a risk of chronic illnesses. So this is something that I'm happy to talk much more about. I have a rich background in public health, but I'm going to move on to the next piece, because the disparities that we're facing as you look at this child in this neighborhood compared to this neighborhood has a lot to do with ongoing what happens to people inside. There is such thing as a healthy ecosystem. And if one is fortunate enough to grow up in a neighborhood where there are opportunities for young people, where there are public libraries, where there are wonderful parks, civic engagement, these are the neighborhoods that are priming young people to thrive, because there's this ongoing message. So it's very important for us to look at the systems that are surrounding young people. Segregation works like a burglar in the night. And even though no one may awaken, we see valuable things disappear, such as quality schools, safe playgrounds, good jobs, a healthy environment, safe housing, transportation, and healthcare. Residential segregation and zoning in many neighborhoods throughout the region, you will see this kind of example, directly as a result of redlining and residential segregation and exclusion, where you see new housing developments in the same area of old rusting industrial plants. And part of this is really a biological issue. We know that contaminants in the soil, that lead, they lead to physiological changes, far more likely that those children aren't going to be able to achieve what they should in school. It's the beginning of the disparities pathway. And we know that people of African ancestry and Latinx ancestry are far more likely to live in high poverty tracts. And so there you're beginning to see the fact that there's a concentration of people who are Black and brown in certain neighborhoods, which is a predictor of lifelong outcomes. And so just looking at the neighborhoods in which we raise our children, in which we expect children to thrive, I think it's very important for us as a society to have the opportunity for some real self-examination. Same thing is true with playground and outdoor spaces. When this is your playground and it's right on the edge of a factory and children are crawling on the grass and playing ball and rolling around, what do you expect? So if you look at the whole issue of all kinds of contaminants as compared to this playground down here, and children themselves can see this. And so their own sense of self and sense of value and their own sense of if there is a future or not. So I just briefly want to talk about the whole notion around environmental racism, because I know that there are a number of funders who are very interested in environmental justice. And many people call environmental racism a form of slow death that is actually akin to violence, because the toxic pollutions themselves are a form of violence. Communities are degraded, they're brutalized by this ongoing presence of the contaminants, as well as the consistent message of who is valued and who matters and who does not. And so there's an emphasis, and many people have begun to talk about toxic landscapes, that they're out of sight, but out of sight to whom? And so how can we actually, as people of integrity, turn our backs on many of these communities which are right in our region? And it's something that I'm hoping we may have an opportunity to discuss more within the work of the network. Many people have coined the term of a sacrifice zone, that they're just parts of our community that they're permanently impaired. And we just leave them, if you will, in old times when people would leave a disabled child on the hillside to die. And it's quite profoundly disturbing, but it's kind of land that is so contaminated, or areas that are so frightening. And these areas are too frequently the areas where Black and brown families and children live and grow up. So I just wanted to bring this to our mind as we begin to talk about violence, because the legacy of othering, of racism, of exclusion, of oppression is at the grounding of some of the causes and the issues that we're really trying to look at. If we're really interested in prevention, how do we prevent violence in community and really going back to root causes is very, very important. Slow violence, many people would call it a wicked problem because it is very difficult to move forward. And I think a number of you know this notion of a wicked problem, that there's not a clear definition, that there are many stakeholders with conflicting agendas, that every solution ramifies throughout various aspects of the system. They take a long time to evaluate, and they're never completely solved. And I think in this one, we really do have a wicked problem, but it's something that we can rise above. Going back to this notion of the socio-ecological framework of Urie Bronfenbrenner, how these challenges permeate throughout the level, and many of you are very familiar with adverse childhood experiences, and we know that violence is one of them. So I just wanted to start with kind of a ground base in a very comprehensive frame. I'm moving away and would love to welcome my colleague, Anne Marie McGrory, to talk a little bit about the amazing work that she has been engaged in with the Stoneleigh Foundation.
Thank you so much, Christine, and good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to begin by really thanking Christine for those powerful opening framing remarks about what it really means when we say that gun violence is an urgent public health crisis facing our city. And I also just wanted to extend my sincere thanks as we come to the end of the day to the entire Philanthropy Network team for putting together yet another thought-provoking, engaging, and I think very relevant SPARX conference. I'm especially grateful for the opportunity to share a few brief remarks with you about, as Christine referenced, the Stoneleigh Foundation's efforts to address Philadelphia's gun violence epidemic. As you said, my name is Anne Marie McGrory. I am the Director of Communications at the Stoneleigh Foundation. For those of you who aren't familiar with Stoneleigh, we were founded in 2006 by the late John and Cara Haas. And over the past 15 plus years, our mission has been to improve the life outcomes of our community's youth and young adults by advancing change in the systems that serve them. And we do so by awarding fellowships to leaders who work either within, alongside, and increasingly outside of these systems to catalyze real and lasting change. Before I get into our current work on gun violence, I just wanted to acknowledge the countless community-based organizations, advocates, nonprofits, and other funders who may or may not be on the call today that are focused on and committed to ending this epidemic. Stoneleigh is very honored and humbled to be asked to speak about our work, but we recognize that we are just one example in really a vast constellation of public, private, civic, and community stakeholders that care deeply about ending this crisis and the trauma that it is causing for kids, for families, entire neighborhoods, and really for the city at large. And on a personal note, I'm looking forward to the breakout sessions shortly where we can hear and learn from all of you about how to strengthen philanthropy's response to gun violence. So with that, just a little bit of background on our work. Over the last several years, the Stoneleigh Foundation has built a growing portfolio of investments focused on gun violence. These include strengthening the role of youth voice in prevention policy efforts, using data to identify promising intervention opportunities for those who have experienced either experienced or been impacted by a firearm injury, and deepening the media narrative to focus on root causes and solutions, which I'll talk a little bit more about momentarily. Building on those efforts from the last several years, we launched our gun violence public voice strategy in July, with the goal of leveraging our institutional influence and really elevating our voice on the gun violence epidemic and its impact on youth, young adults, and families in Philadelphia. And there are three parts of the strategy that I'd like to just highlight here. First, we've recently launched a call for applications for nonprofit, academic, and public sector organizations that are interested in hosting an emerging leader fellowship focused on addressing gun violence from a policy, practice, research, advocacy, organizing, or communications lens. And because of the urgency of this issue, we are committing all 5 of our available fellowship slots to focus on this issue, which is a first for us in the 15-year history of the program. We're also specifically prioritizing projects that are led by or that meaningfully center the voices of communities and individuals with lived experience of gun violence in our city. Secondly, and in concert with the fellowship recruitment effort, we are hosting an upcoming virtual convening series to foster dialogue about gun violence interventions and solutions in Philadelphia. The series will feature practitioners, organizers, advocates, and researchers who will examine gun violence from a wide array of perspectives, including education, public health, law enforcement, youth engagement and advocacy, and media. And they will share actionable solutions from their various vantage points. We really feel strongly that any sort of public dialogue on this issue that is so urgent needs to be action-oriented. And finally, the third part of our gun violence strategy has been interrogating and changing the way we talk about this issue in the public sphere, and specifically in the news media. And to that end, we are partnering with the Philadelphia Center for Gun Violence Reporting on several projects aimed at deepening the media narrative, educating the public on root causes and solutions, and as I said before, centering the voices of individuals with lived experience of this epidemic. And in particular, we're looking at ways of diverting media attention away from harmful episodic accounts of gun violence to more thematic, contextualized reporting that leads to more empathetic, ethical, and impactful journalism, and that reduces harm for victims and families and increases the likelihood of positive interventions being adopted by our leaders. This focus on changing the narrative comes out of our genuine belief that the choices that we make about how we present information, in other words, how we frame either a problem or a solution, can directly impact the thoughts, beliefs, and behaviors of policymakers and the public at large. So that was a quick overview of the 3 components of our strategy, but you can learn more about our gun violence work, including the upcoming events and the fellowship recruitment effort at StoneleigHFoundation.org/gunviolence. We here at Stoneleigh really believe that meaningful and effective efforts to address gun violence in our city should integrate a broad array of strategies and stakeholders working collaboratively to accomplish specific and clearly articulated goals for the immediate term, as well as for the middle term and for the long term. What I've shared here today is simply our preliminary attempt within the context of our organization's size, capacity, funding approach, and mission to just begin to address this crisis within our capacity and constraints. The challenge of gun violence in our city is as complex as it is urgent, and we believe that it will require a significant mobilization and marshaling of our collective resources, our collaboration, creativity, humility, and moral leadership. And with that, I wanted to thank so many of you for what you are doing to work to eradicate gun violence in our city. It's been really a privilege to get to share a window into Stoneleigh's work. And as I said, I look forward to hearing from you during the upcoming breakout session about what you all are doing. Hopefully this will be the beginning of a much longer and larger citywide dialogue. So with that, thank you so much again, and I'll turn it back to Christine.
I am muted, but not any longer. Thank you so very much, Anne Marie. I am thrilled to have you as a partner, and I couldn't have a better partner for this particular session. As Anne Marie mentioned, and I think was stated earlier, we're going to move into a series of breakout groups. And one of the breakout groups, I think, is going to be focused on what funders can do. We asked Anne Marie if she would share the work that she was engaged in with Stoneleigh, because many funders feel as though it's not possible for them to have an impact unless they have the largesse of someone such as the Gates Foundation or the Bezos Foundation. And in this work, there's there's really a place for everyone. So we really do look forward to a very robust discussion, quite frankly, on how the region has been impacted and what a regional strategy among philanthropic organizations might look like. I also wanted to take a moment to thank everyone. To pull off something of this magnitude takes a host of people. I want to again thank all the presenters. I want to thank Ashley, Alandra, Kiva, and Anne Marie. And also behind the scenes, I want to thank with deep gratitude and admiration, Mariah, Amy, Shira, Jen, Annalisa, and our wonderful tech team. In closing, I had a couple of things that I just wanted to mention because some of you may want to return after the breakout groups and others may have other obligations, and we understand that. But I'd like to reach out to many of you to have an opportunity to meet you in person. I'm going to be starting a listening tour and going around the region. I'm hoping that we might be able to find an opportunity for focus groups and small group gatherings. I want to thank those of you who have welcomed me and saying that you would host me at a variety of either philanthropic or community events, and I really look forward to that. I also wanted to mention that the board of the network is going to be planning a retreat, and we're working together on that in the spring to specifically look at issues around equity and how it's going to impact our work. And I just wanted to end by saying that I believe that this network has the power to impact the philanthropic sector and the greater Philadelphia region in many ways. We can influence, we can connect, engage, and make a real impact with tangible outcomes by building a stronger civil society and prompting civic engagement on issues of equity. So with that, I want to thank you all. I believe that one of my colleagues is going to come in and give us a few specifics as to how we might move into the breakout groups. I look forward to seeing some of you in person on Thursday, and hopefully to meeting many of you soon. All the very best, and thank you so very much for spending such a large portion of your day with us.